Greetings, everyone. You've stumbled upon Esoteric Babble. We are now going to continue our discussion of the Noble Eightfold Path. In the first part, we sort of gave an overview of it, and in this sort of discussion, we're going to talk about the 8 items, sort of point by point, and see how they sort of fit in to our lives and can sort of give us a good framework for everything that we do. Now, one thing before going on, I think I mentioned in the first part of this series now on the Eightfold Path that the way we find this is that the Buddha was teaching this in the Dhammacakkappavattanasuttaṃ, in the sutra on the setting in motion the wheel of the teaching, or just setting in motion, or sort of just starting the teaching, where he talks about the 4 noble truths, and those noble truths are about suffering. So just to recap quickly, the Buddha actually starts the sutta by talking about this middle way that he followed that is neither extremely ascetic, nor is it simply following like a gratification of the senses path. He's taken this middle path, and then he talks about some qualities of that middle path, and then he lists what that middle path is. He calls it this Noble Eightfold Path. Then he goes on to talk about suffering. Now, sometimes that word suffering might be a little maybe too intense for what is actually being, it might be over, how can we say, like, it might be just too strong of a word at times. The word in Pali is dukkha. And so, yes, at times, dukkha can mean actual physical pain, mental pain, but it can also mean just sort of a general unsatisfactoriness to things. It doesn't have to be just a sort of tragic and sort of extremely painful situation when people talk about dukkha. So when I use the word suffering, and that's sort of one of the normal ways to talk about what the Buddha was sort of out to overcome, just keep in mind that the suffering isn't always, it's to be taken in this sort of spirit of unsatisfactoriness and so forth. So in the 4 noble truths, the first noble truth is that there is this thing, suffering, or dukkha. The second noble truth is that dukkha, or suffering, has an origin, a source. The third noble truth is that there is a cessation to suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is that there is a path, or, like a method or a way that leads to the extinction of suffering. And this is where it all comes back full circle. The Buddha asks, what is that path? And he answers, it's the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's sort of how the whole Eightfold Path is situated in the 4 noble truths. Even though it's actually mentioned first, it is part of it is part of the 4 noble truths, and it's actually the way that we would, overcome suffering. And I just bring that up again because it's something that it isn't always, it might not be evident if you just read through the list of the 8 items on the Eightfold Path, but technically this is the way that we, if we set about on this path, we can hopefully, overcome suffering. And we know from the previous episode that this Noble Eightfold Path, by following it, it should produce sort of intuitive insight and intuitive knowledge or wisdom. It should lead to calmness and to sort of special gnosis, special kinds of knowledge, and to enlightenment and to nirvana. Okay, so that's a far longer intro than I had wanted to make for this second section, but I did think it's important to sort of situate the Eightfold Path in, in the Buddha's teaching there. So now, why don't we go kind of item by item? And there's an interesting progression to these eight items, and it starts with, again, we'll just say the Pali first, sammādiṭṭhi, and the samma we're going to hear over and over. That means like the correct or right, and I think sometimes in other contexts you'll hear micca, which I think is the opposite of that, wrong. Like you could have a wrong view, but here we want to have the right view. That's sort of a literal way to think about ditthi, sammādiṭṭhi, the right view. But I think even, in English when we say this, we sort of mean viewpoint or perspective. It's not like you have to have the correct seeing. It's not like you have to have literal 20/20 vision, but we need to develop a good perspective, like a good philosophical perspective, or however you would want to think about that. Some of these perspectives could contain other Buddhist teachings. For instance, there are the three marks of existence, that everything is impermanent, everything is dukkha, that we mentioned before, is sort of unsatisfactory, and that nothing has a self. Sometimes there is no self, or nothing is. You could say that all things are devoid of self, or some sort of soul or abiding entity that doesn't change. Everything that we can think about, see, taste, smell, anything at all that the mind could sort of wrap itself around is subject to change. So that's something that would, I think, constitute right view. In the Dhammapada, it's put in this very poetic and beautiful way. See the world as a bubble, see it as a mirage. The person who sees the world like that is not seen like by the king of death. This right viewpoint, we can certainly have like an intellectual formulation of that, but these things we have to sort of come to know in maybe a deeper way, or something that is not simply driven by the intellect. But you could see already like how having that sort of mindset, like realizing that there isn't anything that won't end someday, including our loved ones, but there isn't anything. Even in one of the, I don't know if it's the 47th koan in Mumonkan, there are like these three barriers set up by one of the teachers, and one of the last ones he asks is like when everything disintegrates, like when the four constituent elements come apart, and that sort of means like, and the whole universe sort of just disappears or dissolves. Where do you go? So again, this is part of the right view. Like having that is a pretty good basis. Knowing about the Four Noble Truths, I think sometimes is considered part of sammādiṭṭhi. But this can work with any sort of just almost, I would say with almost any of the ageless wisdoms, that this is, a right view is going to, there would be how can we say this? There will be viewpoints, or there will be wisdom and teachings expressed that would certainly fall under the heading of sammādiṭṭhi, or right view. We go from right view to sammāsaṅkappo, or sammāsaṅkappo. And then we have to have, here we are talking about the right intention, or the right plan. And so we can see that from our viewpoint, then we start to formulate, we can have a framework where we can sort of start to carry out what we're going to do. And especially in Buddhism, that's important, and this could be true of Hinduism as well, and possibly many other sort of, I don't know if I want to say philosophical schools of thought, but people who believe in reincarnation and karma, or kamma. And like I said, certainly in Buddhism, your mental state is of prime importance. Your action, if you accidentally kill a bug, that's different than trying to kill a bug, maybe, and even not succeeding. So trying to take a life is much worse, probably, than accidentally taking a life. And that's why this idea of your intent is very important. We have to have good intentions. And there's a lot to be said about that. I was reading, I believe it was Steiner's work on, and I'm sort of embarrassed, I'm forgetting the name. I'll put this in the description, but it's about knowledge of the higher world, sort of like the astral planes. And he says something along these lines where he says we have, the person who's an adept or on the spiritual path has to realize that a hateful thought manifests itself in the world just as much as a hateful action does. So the intention is very important. And of course we know that, and we don't really have to have much spiritual wisdom to sort of understand that having a positive mindset sort of helps us be and remain positive, and being negative, I mean, we've probably all seen it in other people, and we've seen it in ourselves, where that, things can just start to unravel if we are particularly negative. So that is the second of the Eightfold Path. Second item. The third one is sammāvācā, or right speech. So I think we all know, thou shalt not lie. This is one of the Buddhist precepts, not to lie. There's probably not many cultures that encourage lying, but that would be, of course, I should say it like this. Often when you think about right speech, we might think about the actual externalizing speech, directing speech at other people, speech with other people. And of course, that's extremely important. But something else you have to think about with right speech is the person you and I speak with most often, and by far we speak with more often, is ourselves. That's something linguists tell us. And we can verify that on our own. I mean, the minute you wake up, there's sort of this unending stream of thoughts going on in your head. And so right speech, again, this kind of comes out of this intention, but the idea of having like a very positive speech and so on and so forth has a real effect on us. I mean, if we're totally sort of down on ourselves and beating ourselves up, not to say that there isn't a time and a place to sort of maybe reassess and really take a a good, honest evaluation of maybe something that you're trying to do or have done or whatever. But basically, we want right speech to be either positive or just minimize all this sort of like critical and all this superfluous, maybe a calming of the speech. So that's one way I think that we could take sammāvācā, or right speech. Now the next one is sammākammanto, or right action, right doing, right practice maybe. So, we've gone from viewpoint to like the intention to the speech, and now we're actually talking about our actions going out into the world. And this, obviously, we want our actions, our doing to be right. We want to make sure that our actions are sort of karmically sort of on the side of good, hopefully. And so, again, I think that it's interesting that if you look at this as a progression, we've started with the viewpoint, the intention, the speaking, and then now we've gotten to the actions. I mean, we don't put the actions ahead of this other stuff. The actions are sort of a fruition of this this right view and the intent and the speaking. The speaking, by the way, to just back up, I mean, that could almost be, some parts of speaking could be the chanting of mantras or of magic spells, as I like to call them. I know some people recoil in horror, but, saying things to yourself that are going to sort of keep you focused and just positive. I'm using the word positive a lot, but that's sort of what I think that's a good overall word to sort of describe what we're trying to achieve with our, the Buddha would constantly tell us that an unguarded and an untamed and an unprotected and undeveloped or uncultivated mind is very, sort of leads to great, sort of leads to disaster. And so if we can't extinguish our minds, if we don't have a way of like sort of being completely liberated, I think we should at least be on the side of the positive. We should try to be as positive as possible. And again, I think that with these, our actions and our practice is, if we have this positive sort of foundation, the actions are going to flow out of that naturally. And similarly, the next item on the list is sammāājīvo. And that would be like the right living and maybe like right occupation. I know in Thai there's achip is, it's a closely related word, and it may be derived from this word or it may come more from the Sanskrit. But in that case, it sort of means occupation. And the fact of it is, we all have to make a living. It's possible that in some of our cases, someone else made the living for us, and we might live off of a fortune that we were born into. But that's very rare. Most of us have to have some kind of income and work. And, that it starts to get tricky as, our world is very connected by by commerce and trade and transnational corporations. So it's not, it's one thing to like live in a village and work there and maybe help people out or do whatever you're doing. But no matter what your livelihood is, it's even possible to sort of negatively impact people just by the things we buy or something. So that actually could go back to the sammākammanto, the right actions. But I think it's worth thinking about here that when we have, or since we have to have jobs and we have to make an income, we want it to be as humane and as sort of, again, positive as possible. Obviously, we don't want to become bank robbers, and we don't want to just sort of, we shouldn't be stealing anyway, but we don't want to, we really want to have jobs where we're not cheating people out of things. And so this is something that everyone has to address, because there's so many things that, are kind of at play here. But in general, like I said, we should try to make sure that what we're doing is humane, and that we're not really trying to lie or cheat to people to, get money out of them, which I think in many, many traditions that would just not, any form of like deception is not kindly looked upon, and actually can be illegal in certain circumstances anyway. So that sort of brings us, we're getting near the end. Now, after sammāājīvo, we have sammāvāyāmo. And vayāmo has to do with the right effort. And actually, I would say, in this case, maybe we could even think about it as being like the right, like keeping up the right amount of energy for our appointed task, which, by the way, is this Eightfold Path. We've probably all come, or we've probably all been in situations where we've had some work to do, and the last part is the hardest. Just maintaining any sort of like interest and willpower gets to be exponentially harder near the end. It could be filing paperwork for such, for something, or just it could be a creative project or whatever. It's easy as time goes on for sort of the negativity of the world, or just the circumstances to wear on us. So we need, even after having the right livelihood, to keep going, we need to make sure that we have like the right amount of effort, or the right sort of maybe resolve. I think sometimes you hear people call this, but like I said, I would think about like the right amount of energy that we just have to keep going. And that's where being around other people who are on the path is very helpful. It can be very energizing. I've been energized countless times by talking to people who are on the path, and I see as sort of luminaries, or I just get something from them. And that's one reason I like to put this information out there, is not coming at this from any sort of perspective of being in any way a master, or knowing something, or presenting original information. It's just to help us all keep going, to keep up with that effort. And of course, we know, it's easy to intellectually know that we need to do that, but we sometimes just some encouraging words, or just a little burst of energy from someone else, can really help. Now we get to the last two items, sammāsati and sammāsamādhi. So sammāsati, I think we can, initially I was thinking about this as being like the right concentration, and sammāsamādhi being the right meditation. And I think you'll hear samadhi. That's actually sort of a technical term. You'll hear that word used. And that's actually a sort of meditation. There's kind of two kinds of meditation seen, I think, in Theravada Buddhism. There's the samadhi practice, and then there's the vipassana practice. I'm not going to say a lot about that right now. We'll have opportunities to talk about that later. And of course, in Buddhism more broadly, there's sort of a Zen practice of meditation. And I'm sure there are many, many forms of meditation. But getting back to sati, sammāsati, or the right concentration, actually I saw in Stephen Soss's online Pali course, he said, well, the word sati came up, and he mentioned, well, I hope everyone knows that this word means mindfulness. And then, yes, that's that. Of course, that's the perfect translation for that word. I think there's some overlap between the words concentration and mindfulness. Sometimes I think concentration maybe is taken in a way like, hey, concentrate on your work, or but that actually could be taken to be, or to mean, hey, be more mindful of your work. So I don't know that concentration is totally different than mindfulness, but the word mindfulness seems a little more, I don't know. I don't know exactly how to say it. I'm more intuitively drawn to the word mindfulness. And I'd like to hear your comments on what you have to say about that. But so in these last two practices, the sort of mindfulness and meditation, we are sort of, we have to acknowledge, or the Buddha is acknowledging that we have to have this, we have to have these practices in our life. You know, we have to make time for meditation, and we have to be, if you think about mindful, I guess this is one thing where sometimes it seems like you concentrate on a specific task, but we need to be mindful whenever we're doing any action, or any, when we're kind of immersed in all sorts of activities, that we need to be mindful. And we can bring our meditation to those activities. I think that's one of the powerful things of meditation, is that we, typically sit in silence and maybe secluded from people, and we breathe, and we count our breaths, or whatever we're doing. But usually it doesn't take a lot of effort to sort of bring that sometimes into just what you're doing. You could be driving a car, you could be talking to someone, and sort of have this moment of like where you are almost kind of standing back and observing yourself talking and interacting with other people. And so I think that's part of this, the mindfulness and the meditation. It's something that has to, it just has to be part of this whole practice. And because it sort of informs everything else. And that's sort of the last thing I would say about this. I sort of, I can't believe how long I've been sort of talking about this, and I'm just scratching the surface. But when you think about these 8 items, or these 8 different practices, or even steps along the path, you could sort of think of them as sort of happening in a sequence, or you could certainly see how you might start with the right view and go to the right sort of intention, and end up at the sort of the right meditation. But actually, this stuff is all sort of interpenetrates. These interpenetrate one another, and the right view can inform your right, or your meditation. We'll just drop the word right for now. Your resolve can even, sort of your resolve, or your desire to keep at it, your effort can go back and inform your right speech and your right actions. And so this stuff is all put together. And I think that's part of the reason there's a wheel. There's a lot of reasons to sort of think about things as being on a wheel, like the wheel of fortune, where you can, one day you're up and the next day you're down. But if you think about these 8 different practices on a wheel, especially if it's turning, they're sort of all getting mixed together, especially if you're trying to keep one spoke of the wheel separate from another when it's rolling. It's a little hard. So I think that's where I'm going to leave this whole thing. And I would certainly be interested in hearing from other people, whatever you have to say regarding your experiences with the Eightfold Path. I find it to be the sort of thing that, like a lot of deep sort of perennial ageless wisdom, it becomes more relevant as you go on, and you see sort of and we can sense the depths of these practices and how doing them, they get deeper and deeper. And so I think that's a good way, sort of a good just first step into the Eightfold Path. And as I said before at the beginning, I think the main thing to keep in mind, something that's really important and powerful, is to think about how the Buddha has prefaced this by stating that following this path is going to lead to calm, to special sorts of knowledge, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. That's worth meditating up on for sure. So I hope this is somewhat helpful. And as always, peace to everyone, and may all beings everywhere be happy.